Hello and welcome, dear listeners. You're tuning in to the ReGENERATE project podcast on regenerative agriculture. Join us as we explore new approaches to soil, landscape, and the future of farming. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Your host, Radim Kužel.
Today I would like to welcome Mr. Rostislav Mátl from DVP Agro. DVP Agro is an agricultural company farming in South Moravia, just south of Brno. Hi, Rosta. Could you introduce DVP Agro to us a bit more? How much land you farm, what crops you grow, and in what context you operate?
Hi, Radim. Greetings to the listeners. We are the company DVP Agro, and together with neighboring farms, we manage roughly 1,500 hectares of land using regenerative practices. The area about 30 kilometers south of Brno is rather drought-prone. We have around 480 millimeters of average annual precipitation. Rainfall fluctuates up and down, but the long-term average stays roughly the same. The bigger issue is warming. The average temperature is rising, and when rain does fall, the water evaporates much faster. That's one of the main reasons why we started with regenerative farming.
So you're farming in a relatively challenging area. You're one of those medium to medium-large farms that have been practicing regenerative agriculture for quite some time now. You started with some initial steps about 5 or 6 years ago, maybe even earlier. How did your journey toward regenerative agriculture actually begin?
The journey really began before 2018. Up until then, we focused mainly on precision agriculture, which we still do. For example, soil sampling on a 3-hectare grid. We tried variable rate fertilization and generally aimed to increase intensity. But it didn't really lead anywhere because water is the limiting factor for us, or rather, how we manage water. Before 2018, we worked with cover crops mostly just to comply with legislation. Then, Jaroslav Zahora, who was here recently, as you mentioned, Radim, took us on a field trip to Austria, where he showed us multi-species cover crops. That really inspired us. Since around 2019, we've been growing cover crops on approximately 500 hectares every year, so that the soil remains covered, we can capture CO2, build organic matter, and cool the soil. Cover crops bring many benefits. Maybe we'll talk about that more later.
When you mentioned soil analyses that you did in the past and are probably still doing today, do you see any impact of regenerative farming in the results of those soil tests? Is anything visibly changing?
Yes, there are visible changes. For example, the cation exchange capacity maps used to be very colorful and uneven, and now the colors are gradually evening out, meaning the exchange capacity is improving. We've reduced phosphorus fertilization. Basically, we fertilize mainly with compost and digestate. Even though phosphorus inputs have been slightly reduced, phosphorus levels are not decreasing. On the contrary, it seems to be moving into the productive zone of the soil. So the situation is either improving or staying at the same level as before the previous measurement.
So that exchange capacity might indicate that soil organic matter is improving. Have you done any analyses specifically focused on organic matter or calcium oxide? And what are the results?
We cooperate within several systems. We are part of the Carboneg system, and we have a contract with Carboneg. There were 2 soil analyses carried out there, and compared to the first one, we increased by about 0.07%. But calcium oxide is a parameter where you really can't draw conclusions from just one difference. You need a longer-term trend. Through another organization, we've already done a 3rd sampling, and there's also a visible upward trend. They also measure biological indicators, bacteria and fungi, and those have increased as well. So I think we're heading in the right direction.
So the fungi to bacteria ratio has increased, meaning a higher share of fungi.
Yes, the proportion of fungi is increasing. We're also involved in various projects where soil samples are taken. What was particularly interesting were DNA analyses, where DNA samples were taken separately for fungi and bacteria. The results were compared with a semi-regenerative system, mainly involving strip-till, in Tropki at Reno Farmi, and also compared with forest soil. And it actually didn't turn out badly. The results were quite good. We cooperate with Czech Globe, with Mendel University, and today I promised Ms. Milbachova from the Czech Agri-Food Research Center that we would provide some data as well. We're also registered in another project there. So yes, we're trying.
So you can see that it's leading somewhere. visually but also scientifically, supported by analytical results. There is real improvement.
Exactly. For example, a student chose to monitor insect abundance for his bachelor's thesis. He compared organic farming, conventional farming, and regenerative farming. He hasn't finished all the calculations yet, but he said that in the regenerative fields, where cover crops are present and the soil is covered, there is significantly more insect life, and consequently, more birds and other wildlife as well.
So what does regenerative agriculture look like on your farm in practice? Because from farm to farm and country to country, the approach can differ. How do you approach tillage or no-till, cover crops, crop rotation, and later we'll go more into fertilization? But how do you prepare the soil, or not prepare it?
Of course, over time since 2019, when we started with cover crops, we've also been learning through YouTube, articles, and various sources. We experimented with reducing soil tillage. At first, we tested it on a few fields, saw that it works, and now for the past 3 years, we've basically been using our regenerative approach across the entire area. Soil tillage. It's not that we don't till at all. There are several reasons why we still do some shallow tillage, usually up to 5 centimeters. We sow cover crops using strip till, which is a kind of band tillage. Immediately after loosening the strip, we sow the cover crop mix so that roots quickly occupy the loosened space and prevent recompaction, or as Jarda says, puttying. When it rains, fine particles can move downward and seal the soil again, but if you sow immediately, roots occupy the space and the root channels remain.
And you aim to maintain permanent soil cover throughout the year?
Yes. After harvesting the main crop, if a spring crop is planned, we sow a diverse cover crop mix. We use a 14-species winter-killed mix, and then spring crops like sunflower or maize are sown directly into the winter-killed cover. We also grew sugar beet this way until last year, but this year, the sugar factory was closed. Sugar beet was more complicated and yields were lower. So far, strip till for cover crops, combined with slight soil disturbance in the strips, has proven effective, while spring crops are then sown using no-till.
So the tillage doesn't mix the soil, it just loosens it?
Yes, it's a tine with a width of 2.4 centimeters or 24 millimeters. We used to have a tracked tractor, but we mainly used it for strip till sowing of cover crops. It wasn't used enough, so we sold it and bought a powerful wheeled tractor, which is more versatile and can be used for more tasks throughout the year.
You mentioned crops like maize, sunflower, spring crops, wheat, rapeseed, but you're also experimenting with new or less traditional crops that aren't common on Czech farms. What are your experiences with these crops, and which ones are they?
We have a perennial crop that we're testing on 6 hectares. This is the 4th year, I think, cut plant or Danube sylphy. We also tried intercropping maize with beans. We grow some components for our cover crop mixes, such as safflower, crimson clover for seed multiplication, buckwheat, lacy phacelia. I hope I'm not forgetting anything. We tried faba beans, but due to limited water availability, yield stayed around 1 ton per hectare for 3 years, so we abandoned that. This year, we grew Bengal vetch, which worked quite well.
So you also multiply a lot of seed for your own mixes and experiment quite a bit.
Yes, for example, black oats, we use the whole plant in our mixes. This year, we also multiplied sorghum, which we harvested using a stripper header that we have from soufflé. I think this is the 3rd year we've been using it, so we've had time to evaluate it.
So overall, you have quite a diverse crop rotation. If we stay with agrotechnology for a moment, one of the pillars of regenerative agriculture is also reducing nitrogen fertilization, or at least reducing it over time. You use a lot of organic fertilizers. How does fertilization work on your farm, whether with digestate, as you mentioned, or with mineral fertilizers? Roughly how many units of nitrogen do you apply per crop? Could you explain that a bit?
We divide it like this. The fields that are close to our biogas plant, there we try to base everything on digestate and compost. We also use compost on fields that are farther away, so mainly digestate. Fields that are farther from the biogas plant often overlap with sanitary protection, where liquid fertilizers such as slurry are prohibited. At the time those regulations were written, digestate didn't exist yet, so the operating rules explicitly ban slurry. Because of that, we don't apply digestate there and instead use industrial mineral fertilizers. We don't overdo it. For wheat, it's roughly around 120 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare if I sum it all up.
And what yield potential are we talking about approximately?
For wheat, durum wheat, Last year, it was around 5.9 tons per hectare. Soft wheat didn't perform much better. We still struggle to improve yields there. This year, we tried regulating it earlier, already in autumn, so hopefully it will work better. Maize performs better for us. Silage yields are around 45 tons of fresh matter per hectare on average. For grain maize, yields range from about 8 to 12 tons per hectare, depending on how dry the field is. So with grain maize, I'd say we're satisfied. After cover crops, the stands look better. We sow the cover crop using strip till, and then, where fields are close to the digestate source, we fertilize the cover crop with digestate. Sometimes, compost is also applied before the end of the year, before December 15th, which is the deadline after which fertilization is prohibited, including compost. So a lot of nitrogen is accumulated in the cover crop biomass. Our cover crop mixes also include nitrogen-fixing species, faba beans, vetch, field peas, so they also bind some atmospheric nitrogen. What is proven effective for maize is that we sow it directly into the winter-killed cover crop without any starter fertilization. Usually, we first roll the winter-killed cover crop down. We use kerner cut rollers, but it can also be done with a Cambridge roller, a mulcher, or even with a disc harrow, just shallow, around 2 centimeters.
I actually rolled mine at home this way with a disc harrow recently, so it does work.
What's important is to get the biomass into contact with the soil, because the soil contains plenty of microorganisms, fungi, and so on. These then inoculate the dying, drying plant material, which decomposes much faster. So we sow directly, without starter fertilization, and during maize growth, we later apply digestate using a hose applicator. This year, we did in-min measurements, and there was actually plenty of nitrogen present.
So you basically use the cover crop as a nutrient reservoir that later releases nutrients for the main crop. So maize grown near the biogas plant is produced entirely without mineral fertilizers.
Yes, without mineral fertilizers.
You also mentioned compost. Do you produce your own compost, or do you buy it?
We do both. We produce compost and also buy some. We buy from a company that collects grass, branches, and similar material from municipalities. I don't know the exact term, biodegradable waste. They process this waste. We take that material. Another input is the solid separator fraction from the biogas plant. Then we bring in poultry manure, both wet and dry, from nearby poultry farms we have agreements with. We also get material from the zoo, some wood chips when available, and horse manure. We collect horse manure from 3 or 4 stables. We pile everything up and mix it in very precise proportions. Everything that comes in is mixed thoroughly together. That's the correct ratio.
So it's mixed somewhere in the farmyard or in a silage bunker?
We rent one field manure storage site in Razgrad and another in Vranovice. And when we finish feeding silage, we also use the silage bunker. We pile the separator there as well. We mix the compost 3 or 4 times before application. Turning it causes the compost to heat up, which leads to a thermal phase where weed seeds, from hay, horse manure, or various weeds, are destroyed. Temperatures reach around 50 to 70 degrees Celsius for several days.
So you let the compost mature longer rather than using young compost?
Yes, it's usually between 6 and 9 months old. We try to apply everything we prepare, though it doesn't always work out. Some compost is older, some younger. And then, according to the law, we incorporate it into the soil. Of course, we'd prefer not to have to incorporate it, as is possible in Slovakia, France, and elsewhere where we've seen surface application. But here, we comply by applying compost mainly into cover crops or into wheat. In wheat, we incorporate it with a rotary hoe, very shallow. In cover crops, we incorporate it by laying the cover crop down using the kerner cut rollers, which we consider ideal incorporation. So, legal requirement fulfilled. Check. Done.
You touched on an interesting topic there, because you're also the chairman of the Association for Regenerative Agriculture, if I'm saying that correctly. As part of that association, you're probably also trying to push for legislative changes. Do you have any updates on whether the requirement to incorporate compost might change in the future?
I think things have started to move. As the Association for Regenerative Agriculture, we've been trying to convince the ministry that compost shouldn't have to be incorporated. We're also part of another association, the Association for Innovation and Sustainable Agriculture, a group of innovative farmers, where we also explain this issue. Additionally, in cooperation with the Agricultural and Ecological Regional Agency and Ms. Hayatkova, and together with Yaroslav Zahora, soil tests were conducted to demonstrate that surface application has positive effects and can be better than incorporation.
So the goal is to allow application into cover crops, or even directly on the surface.
The main goal is that compost wouldn't have to be incorporated at all. If the compost is stable, meaning low nitrogen content or a correct carbon to nitrogen ratio, it should be allowed to remain on the surface. We've clearly seen that when compost was left on the surface and rain came before we could even lightly incorporate it, during heavy rainfall, the areas with surface compost had stable aggregates, no runoff, better infiltration. There are many positive effects. And I think the Ministry of Environment and the Ministry of Agriculture are starting to understand this, so hopefully things will move forward.
So you think this could realistically change in the near future? As part of this association, do you also cooperate with foreign organizations? Or is there some kind of collaboration or exchange of information within Europe?
Yes, we do cooperate. We've hosted the Austrian association Boden.Leben, and we've also had visitors from a group in Croatia. They don't have a formal legal status, but they're a really solid group of farmers who organize themselves on Facebook and decide where to travel together. They've already visited us twice, and I feel the need to organize a trip to visit them, because even though they are smaller farmers, they use very interesting techniques. I think it would be inspiring for our members. We've also returned the visit to Austria, which was very interesting. Hans Genauer, who is the chairman of Boden.Leben, will probably give a lecture next year at the Żywa Kraina event here at CZU. That will be interesting. He even grows potatoes in a regenerative way. It's a kind of combination. He roughly cultivates the potato field in autumn, then sows a mix of flax and phacelia into it, and in spring he plants potatoes more or less conventionally. But the soil structure in those potato fields was excellent. The infiltration tests turned out well, so they clearly have some good ideas.
In one episode of our podcast, we also talked about experiences from Germany with potato cultivation, but there it was more about mulching and covering the ridges. When you exchange information with these international groups, do you see differences in how regenerative agriculture is approached, or any other interesting practices worth mentioning?
Every farmer has their own way of doing things. It's never exactly the same. The principles are the same, but techniques differ. Some farmers have their own tweaks or specially modified machines. It also depends a lot on the region. One of the Croatian farmers, for example, grows maize into winter-killed cover crops, a mix of rye, vetch, field peas, rapeseed, and who knows what else. He sows directly into it. There's a roller in front that lays down the rye, which is about 1.5 meters tall, and then he seeds with a 4-row planter straight into it. But he gets 800 to 900 millimeters of rainfall per year. We tried the same thing here, and it was a disaster. So that's something we simply can't do. You really have to test what works for you. It's best to start experimenting on smaller areas, which we're not very good at. When we get excited about something, we go all in, and then it gets complicated.
So this kind of confirms that regenerative agriculture isn't a fixed recipe, but rather a set of tools and approaches that need to be adapted to local conditions. If you get 400 millimeters of rainfall and somewhere else they get 1,200 millimeters, you can't just copy it directly.
Exactly.
How did you originally get started on your path toward regenerative agriculture? And where did you later gather information on how to implement it?
When it comes to cover crops, I think the biggest impulse came from engineer Zahora, who took me and a few friends to Austria to see diverse cover crop mixtures. There, he introduced us to Wilfried Hartl from Bioforschung Austria. Later, I attended a paid 2-day seminar with Wilfried Hartl. He mentors both organic and conventional farmers and focuses heavily on cover crops, so there was a lot to take away. Then, there was a lot of reading about no-till systems in the US, Gabe Brown, Frederic Thomas in France. A big inspiration was also Soil Tech, which later paused its activities at Soufflé. At that time, it was led by Martina Polikova. There are lots of videos with Mathieu Archambaud and Frederic. Their book was translated into Slovak as Cover Crops in Practice. A lot of it was YouTube, because I'm not very strong in languages, but YouTube works great because you can turn on subtitles and then auto-translate them. If it's longer, you can pause it, read, then continue, and even work alongside it.
Nowadays, there's a huge amount of information and knowledge available online, so it's definitely important to search for it, spend time on it, and keep educating yourself.
And now, it's good that there are more of us regenerative farmers, both within the association and outside it, so we can share experiences, what works and what doesn't.
And it's important to exchange information with other farmers.
And not only to show off what worked, but especially what didn't. That way, if someone wants to try it themselves and sees that something failed twice for someone else, they won't try it on 200 hectares, but maybe just on 10.
Do you have an overview of how many regenerative farmers there are in the Czech Republic, or roughly how much land this covers?
Within our association, we have a questionnaire where each farm commits to how many hectares they will manage regeneratively. I think we're currently around 10,000 hectares under regenerative management. The total land farmed by those enterprises might be around 50,000 hectares altogether. That's just an estimate. We could check the website for exact numbers.
Do you see a growing trend or increasing momentum among new farmers?
This year, we weren't very active in promoting the association or recruiting new members. Last year, quite a few joined, but this year it was only a handful. We've slowed down a bit on promotion.
But you still organize a lot of field days on your farm, and you've been doing that for several years now. I hope you'll continue.
Yes, we will. The program runs in 3-year cycles, and we're now in the second cycle. This is our 4th year, so we'll definitely continue for at least 2 more years. Attendance has been good. The last event had around 65 people. What's interesting is how many young people attend. When we started 4 years ago, we had a lot of wise guys telling us it couldn't work. Now, it's mostly people who are already trying something themselves and come for inspiration. The atmosphere is much more pleasant.
Have there been people who came to your field days not farming regeneratively and later actually became regenerative farmers?
Yes, I think so. I can't recall everyone exactly, but for example, people from Reno Farmy like Lukasz Kupec. They decided to start experimenting and were coming to see us from the beginning. I think we were at least an inspiration for them in cover crops and related practices. Now, in turn, we learn from them. More textbook approaches on how to move further, for example, with wheat. People from Slovakia also visit us. Even though the demo farms are primarily for Czech farmers, Slovaks come as well. And not just farmers, gardeners too, or even a former horticulture school teacher. We get all kinds of visitors.
So your events really reach a broad audience. At one of your events, maybe 2 years ago, you had quite serious issues with voles during the nationwide outbreak. How is the vole situation now on your farm? This is a topic farmers often ask about in connection with regenerative agriculture, and there are even working groups on it. Did regenerative farming have any effect? And what's the current situation?
Professor Sukamel, who also gave a lecture at one of our open days and studied voles in sorghum on our farm, said that sorghum seems to repel them to some extent. But he also predicts another population peak next year. We do see voles. For example, after harvesting crimson clover, we deliberately sowed sorghum to test whether it would repel them. When the sorghum was still short, it didn't really work. At that point, the sorghum was more of an additional cover crop alongside volunteer plants, and those volunteers were being grazed quite intensively. You can see 10 to 15 herons on the field every day trying to help control the voles. But we've decided that if vole pressure becomes too high, we'll do some light soil disturbance to make life harder for them. We've done that in some places. This year, voles are a bit more visible. Interestingly, the student who was collecting insect samples also caught voles in his alcohol traps as a side product. He said the vole numbers were roughly similar in organic systems, conventional systems with tillage, and on our regenerative fields.
And how do you deal with voles on your farm? Do you use any specific practices?
We can't use stutox or any rodenticides at all because we have protected species here, like hamsters, ground squirrels, little owls, and owls. Whenever there's a protected species, there's a buffer zone around it, and those zones overlap so much that we only have one field where application would even be allowed. So we don't apply anything. During the 2022 to 2023 period, when vole pressure was high, we reported damages to the National Parks and Protected Landscape Areas Authority, and I have to say they compensated it willingly. So that helped. But we're prepared. If vole numbers increase significantly, we're ready to do some shallow tillage to make conditions less comfortable for them. For now, we're monitoring vole activity. This wet weather doesn't suit them very well, so hopefully the pressure will decrease a bit. Our goal isn't to eliminate voles entirely. They can be there, just in reasonable numbers, so there's enough food for predators.
For predators, you support them by installing nesting boxes so they have places to nest and help keep the land under control. Do you see any other pests increasing as a result of the transition to regenerative agriculture?
This spring, we had a slightly bigger issue with wireworms in maize. It mainly affected hybrids with lower cold tolerance. This year's spring was colder, and the hybrids that were more cold tolerant escaped the wireworms faster. The slower growing maize was hit more. We haven't used force insecticide or anything like that for several years. We even replaced fungicidal seed treatment with compost teas. But now, we'll probably have to use force again. So wireworms were a bit of a problem, although it may be a year-specific issue. It doesn't necessarily repeat every year. But to be safe, we'll have to intervene.
We often encounter people adopting regenerative agriculture mainly to combat erosion. Water erosion probably isn't very visible on your land, but wind erosion is more typical in South Moravia. What effect does regenerative farming have on wind erosion? Is there visibly less of it?
Yes, definitely. It's excellent for erosion control. When we did infiltration tests, water soaked in several times faster. Last autumn, when about 150 millimeters of rain fell over 3 days, we had no problems anywhere. Before 2019, we occasionally did. We don't have many steep fields, but I had seen issues before. Since adopting these practices, we've had no water erosion and no wind erosion either. Wind erosion is sometimes a problem here. When farmers prepare soil into dust in spring and strong winds come, it turns into something like a desert storm. We don't have that issue. The only wind erosion we see comes from neighboring fields. That soil gets caught in our crop residues and cover crop remains, so in a way, it works for us and benefits our land.
Do you see any effect or feedback from people in nearby villages or towns? Do they react to how you farm and how your practices have changed over time? Is the feedback positive?
We organized an event for landowners who lease land to us. We wanted to explain why and how we farm this way, because we'd receive feedback like, it was always plowed, shallow plowing, deep plowing, and now you just drive over it and don't do anything? So we organized an event where we explained everything. We also invited Associate Professor Smutny from academia, who showed photos from his own garden and explained things. Some people were enthusiastic. Others kept the same attitude as before. Mayors tend to view it positively. They're interested in modern approaches. Recently, we won a tender where a municipality had erosion problems and wanted farming practices to change. We won about 10 hectares. We'll farm it specifically because the municipality wants better land stewardship. Price wasn't the main criterion. The farming method was. We committed to agroforestry, infiltration strips, growing legumes, intercropping, diverse cover crops, everything. Now, we have to deliver. It's a highly erosion-prone field, marked as red, so it's a challenge. It will be closely monitored. The municipality terminated the lease with the previous farming enterprise, announced a tender. Nobody applied in summer, then launched a second round, and that's when we applied. I think awareness will continue to grow, and landowners should be more interested in how their land is farmed, especially erosion-prone land. So the most fertile soil doesn't wash down into the village, but stays on their parcel and improves in quality.
I think that's great news. That landowners, whether municipalities or private owners, are becoming more interested in how farmers treat their soil. It's a hopeful sign that regenerative farmers may gain access to more land in the future. As a final topic, I'd like to touch on economics. Has reduced tillage helped lower costs? On the other hand, cover crops can increase costs. How has this played out economically, now that you have 5 or 6 years of data?
I think yields were lower in the first years, especially for maize. Now, when I compare our averages with what we buy for the biogas plant from neighboring farms, we're very similar. So maize yields are the same. Wheat yields are slightly lower for us. Soybean yields this year were about 2.7 tons, similar to the area average. But our costs are slightly lower. We don't need as many machines or operations. On the other hand, cover crops do add costs. That's true. Some farms will be in the red for the 3rd year in a row this year. We're still in profit, not a big one, but we are profitable. And we know our soil is improving. Some of that money isn't sitting in a bank account, but is invested in better soil. When we visited Frédéric Thomas in France, he explained that when soil accumulates more organic matter, the nitrogen to carbon ratio is roughly 1 to 10. When fertilizers became very expensive, he sometimes did light tillage to release some carbon and make nitrogen available, avoiding fertilizer costs. So soil also acts as a kind of bank you can work with.
So you're investing in soil. Cover crops aren't really a cost, but rather an investment in the future.
Exactly. Today we were at a roundtable on carbon farming, and a colleague, Mr. Najedli, talked about contracts often being short-term, making commitments difficult. I argue that every farm loses and gains hectares every year. Someone terminates a lease, someone offers new land. We're slowly growing. We buy land, leases expire, we start farming it, and sometimes we lose land too. But overall, we gain more than we lose. So I don't think a 5-year lease is a problem. In practice, we farm roughly the same land continuously. We make no distinction between owned and leased land. Blocks are usually mixed, 1/3 owned, 2/3 leased. We don't say, this is ours, so we'll apply more compost. That makes no sense. We treat everything as if it were our own.
But we often see farmers treating owned land differently from leased land.
Yes, we try not to think about it that way and do everything consistently.
All right. Thank you for today's interview. I wish you all the best for the future, and I hope the trajectory of soil improvement continues upward. If you had one final message for farmers who don't farm regeneratively yet, but would like to, what would you tell them?
Thank you too, Radim, for the invitation. It was very pleasant being here in the Prague studio. So quiet, which is great. How to motivate them? Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid of cover crops. I think they're the most important thing, even more important than tillage. Don't try it on your entire acreage. Don't rush into it blindly. Start gradually. I believe you'll gradually reach results. You'll enjoy it, your soil will improve, and your mood will improve too. There will be fewer loss-making years and more stability.
Thank you.
Thank you too.
Project ReGENERATE is funded by the European Union. Views and opinions expressed are, however, those of the authors only and do not necessarily reflect those of the European Union or the European Education and Culture Executive Agency. Neither the European Union nor the Executive Agency can be held responsible for them.